Hello, everyone. Jesse here. Welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining us. I hope you're doing well and staying healthy. Today's webinar is presented by Jenny Stuart, Vice President of Consulting at Construx. Jenny oversees Construx's consulting services, where she has helped numerous companies dramatically improve their software development and quality assurance processes. We'll have a brief Q&A at the end of today's presentation, so be sure to ask your questions throughout. To break the ice, feel free to write me in chat and let me know where you're joining us from today. As always, I encourage you to share this webinar with your colleagues and friends who may find today's topic of interest. Jenny, I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you today.
Great, thank you so much, Jesse. Appreciate you joining me today, and for everyone else who's joining me from around the US and around the world, welcome. Today we're going to talk about a brief overview of 3 scaling frameworks, and then I'm going to drop into 6 scaling recommendations, which are really recommendations for practices, approaches that you can use, whether you're in the scaling framework, some of them will be included in that, or just looking to solve some of your existing scaling challenges. So we will first talk about why is scaling so challenging. Then I'll give you a brief overview of less Nexus safe. We'll talk about those 6 recommendations, and I'll leave you with a couple conclusions about scaling. So scaling, in my mind, one of the reasons that scaling frameworks have really started to emerge is because as Agile has become more and more prevalent and predominant, and now really is just the way that we develop software pretty much universally in most organizations, it has been used in larger and larger projects and larger programs. And large projects or solutions or systems are they're fundamentally hard. They're harder than small things. We've got lots of dependencies potentially that we need to manage among multiple teams. And if we do have that situation, it can be challenged to identify them, plan for them, coordinate them. We'll have many more product backlog items than a single Agile team would have. We need to prioritize those. Is the estimation of those items accurate? Is it consistent across all of those teams? We also need to think about how do I get overall good project visibility across all of those teams? I have 15 teams, 50 teams, 100 teams all working together. Do I really have good insight into how far along we are through our overall project or program? Often I'll have a lot more stakeholders to get involved. Some of the organizations I've worked with, the stakeholder for a small project are a handful. The stakeholders for large projects are multiple dozens, often with different needs, different wants, sometimes literally conflicting needs and wants, different priorities. So how do I get them engaged? How do I involve them? How do I understand those needs? How do I capture those needs? How do I then communicate those to all of the teams who are part of building the solution for all of them? And if we look at the data about project outcomes by size, it becomes very clear that large projects are just much more complicated and much more challenging. If you're looking at projects that are really on the quite small side, you're looking at projects that have a very high probability, 80+% probability here in the green, that project is going to come in on time early. It's not going to be challenged. It's not going to be struggling. But even as we start getting into systems that most organizations would consider to be kind of large systems here in a system of about this size, we're starting to look at a completely different picture. Now here we're looking at a 30% probability that system or solution is going to be delivered on time, and 70% odds that it's not. We have talked for a long time about constructs that as you get into very, very large projects or programs, in many cases, you're lucky just to be able to have that be concluded in a way that's reasonably close to what the initial plan was. And we've all seen some of the news for things like IRS.gov, the Denver airport, the IRS modernization project. Our industry is just littered with those situations of large projects just struggling a lot more than small ones. One of the factors to think about there is that the kinds of work that occurs on large projects does actually change. It's different from what occurs on a small project. If you're looking at the work mix on very small projects, you're looking at something that's 2/3 construction, 1/3 other activities. But as you get into systems that are even, what we start to consider as pretty big, that work mix actually changes to 1/3 construction, 2/3 other activities, which is why we see things like in the Scaled Agile framework in SAFe, you start to see architects on the Agile release trains, because there is more architecture work that I need to make sure that I'm successfully delivering the work of 15 teams, whereas one Scrum team, it can be a lot more. It emerges as I go, I put the right people on it. When I now have a glide path of 25 teams, I'm going to need to make sure that I'm giving more architectural guidance and guidelines and patterns and paradigms to those teams to make sure the work is all integrating together or being able to be delivered together in a way that's successful. There's more on the dynamics of size to software projects that I won't go into here, but if this strikes a chord and it's interesting and you want to go into it in more detail, Steve McConnell has a fabulous series called Understanding Software Projects, and he talks about these dynamics of size and much, much more on why size is such a factor in software development. So if that looks interesting in our Construx on-demand ecosystem, those are available and you can explore this topic in much more detail. Really for today, I just want to leave that message that size is more challenging. It's one of the reasons I believe we've seen the scaling frameworks emerge so much, that large projects are just harder than small ones. I do think, however, the idea of really good high fidelity Agile at the team levels does make it easier to be more successful at scale. If my little building blocks are all really high quality building blocks, I'm building on a solid foundation. But just a set of high quality Agile teams, Scrum teams, Kanban teams is not in itself enough because the work mix is changing. We do need to be thinking more about end-to-end system testing. We need to be thinking more about what architecture information do we need. We need to think about how do I coordinate all of those product backlog items. So, well, team level high fidelity agility is wonderful. It alone is not sufficient. We need more than just that to be successful at scale. So with that, let's spend a little bit of time on the different scaling frameworks. We're going to start with LESS and then talk about Nexus. I really think about these two as the simplest way to scale Scrum up. They look a lot like Scrum, they feel a lot like Scrum, and they have a really strong background in Scrum. So LESS comes out of Craig Larman and Bas Voda, who were teaming up together in the mid to late 2000s. They wrote a couple books, and you can go see the evolution of LESS by looking at these books, and then eventually codified all of this in a website, less.works, that has what I cover and much, much more. I see LESS more in Europe than I see it in the US, but I certainly have seen people using it in the US. The structure for LESS is that you're going to have up to 8 Scrum teams working together in this structure. They all have a single product owner. The teams tend to be high preference for feature teams so that the teams can build something that actually produces end-to-end visible user value. They're all guided off of a single master backlog. So I have a single product owner with a single backlog feeding the up to 8 teams to deliver value. And they all share one common definition of done. What does it mean for us to declare the work done inside of a sprint together as this collection of 8 teams? There's one shared definition. The key events in LESS look a lot like Scrum with a few variations. We're going to have Backlog refining. The backlog refining, your mileage is going to vary a little bit, exactly what your backlog refining looks like based on the composition of the teams and the composition of the backlog. You may do whole collaborative backlog refining where every member of every team gets together for backlog refining. You may be doing an approach that's a little bit more like, here's an overall session where we set the context, we set the big picture, we describe what we're trying to accomplish with the top of the backlog, and then teams will break apart. Maybe there's groupings of teams, maybe it's all individual. Really, the backlog refining needs to be what works for you and this group of teams to prepare the backlog for sprint planning and find the patterns that really work well for you. From there, we're going to go into sprint planning. We're going to have part one of sprint planning is having a representative from the teams with the product owner, kind of going through and allocating. This team will do these backlog items, this team will do these backlog items, making sure that they all are going to come together into a cohesive whole. So knowing what that big picture is and then who's going to do which parts of that. After that, you're going to have the representatives go back to their teams and they're going to do what feels like part two or topic two of sprint planning, where they're going to go through and they're going to do the detailed planning of here's how we're going to go about doing this, task things out, have conversations about design activities as needed, and really make sure that they've got a good plan of attack for the sprint. Then after we do our sprint, we're going to deliver an integrated product. The integrated work across all of those teams together is the final deliverable, and we're going to do a sprint review. Again, this can vary a little bit. It could be everybody participating in the sprint review, but often it's a sprint review with representatives from the team, the product owner, and then interested stakeholders, users, sponsors, the people who can give us feedback. And we're really highlighting the work produced across all 8 of those teams and getting feedback on the whole product rather than individual team reviews where we're getting perspective of the pieces of it. We're really looking at the whole in this sprint review. Then we're going to move into a retrospective. First, the teams will do a retrospective. Then they will send a representative to meet with the product owner and talk about the things that are more less wide. What are things that maybe no one team inside of the less unity can solve, but the overall group should be looking at? These could be things like build practices or areas where we need to invest more in unit testing because we keep finding issues. So we're looking at things at that product level here in this second part of the retrospective. So you can see these events look a lot like Scrum. They feel like Scrum. They're a little bit different just because I'm not working with a single team. I'm working with up to 8 teams together. And so I need to make sure that I'm doing coordination across all of those 8 teams. So Jenny, I'm bigger than 8 teams. What do I do now? So if that's the case, you're going to move into what's called less huge. And here we're going to establish a chief product owner, or we're going to establish a product owner, a single person who's responsible for everything. And then each less unit, so these are the lesses, the individual lesses, will have what's called an area product owner. And this area product owner is responsible for delivering something that is customer centric and customer valued. So you can think of it as an area of capability that product owner is going to steward that's part of the whole that we're building together. So you scale less up by having multiple less units, but with a single decision maker across all of those. So less is a great fit for companies that are really looking at the simplest possible way to scale up a set of Scrum teams. It feels a lot like Scrum, it looks a lot like Scrum. People will say large scale Scrum is Scrum, and I think that's right. It's really the simplest way to scale up. The biggest gap is if people are looking at things like portfolio management or product management. Sometimes people look at less and say, well, I don't quite see where the seat at the table is for my chief architect, my solution architect, my senior architect, our product management group. So some people say that, not having considerations for portfolio managements or groups is somewhat challenging and maybe a reason that less doesn't become the solution they decide they want. And the most common criticism is that the product owner is spread thin. So many of us will talk about a product owner can support up to 2 Agile teams, up to 2 Scrum teams. Here we're looking at a product owner for up to 8 teams. So really what they're becoming is the connector between the team and the business, making sure that there's that conversation directly with the team, or the team has the right resources and people on it so that they can really understand the business context and the business need and provide all of that information. So this is one criticism that some people have had with this scaling framework. Looking into Nexus, I feel like Nexus and Less are kind of cousins or siblings. They feel very similar. There are some nuances to them. There's a little bit of difference, but there's a lot of that Scrum is Scrum. It's still Scrum kind of feeling behind them. So Nexus is from Ken Schwaber, one of the co-creators of Scrum. The Nexus Guide was first released in 2015. And so there's a lot of Scrum behind Nexus, you can certainly say, given its background and its creator. One of the things I like about Nexus is you do have this idea of the Nexus integration team. And here we've got our product owner, our Scrum master, and we have 1 or more Nexus integration team members. These people may also be members of individual Scrum teams in the Nexus. But they are accountable and responsible for enabling the overall Nexus to integrate and deliver value. So they are accountable for ensuring that by the end of the sprint, we have a done increment where everything is integrated. And that's not by actually doing the work. That's about building any tooling or infrastructure, mentoring, coaching, establishing standards, establishing practices, other things that allow the other teams in the Nexus to do that integration. So we're not putting the responsibility for doing the work of integrating onto this team. We're giving them more the guidance to ensure that the other teams can do the integration successfully within the sprint boundary. And they provide a focal point for those conversations, for any improvements that we need to make so we can integrate more frequently, we can collaborate effectively, all of that. The structure of Nexus has our product owner, our Scrum Master, and our Nexus integration team. So this is our Nexus integration team. They have a single backlog. And then we have 3 to 9 cross-functional teams. So that's a pretty big range, 3 to 9. Les said up to 8. Nexus is saying 3 to 9. Well, how do I know? Should I have 3? Should I have 9? And what you're really looking at here is it's the number of teams that can effectively work together. So if you're at 5 and things are humming along, you add a 6th and you're still humming along, you're great. You could add a 7th. If you're at 5 and you're kind of struggling a little bit to get everything integrated, and you add 6 and then you're starting to fail to get everything integrated inside of the sprint boundary, go back to 5, look at your practices, look at your tooling, look at your infrastructure, look at what you need to do to be able to more effectively, collaboratively build with more teams, put that in place, and then bring another team in. So that variability is really about saying, what's the number at which you can effectively work together? What's the number where adding another team actually reduces the effectiveness of the team in terms of what they're building or the efficiency of what they're able to build? So a little bit more of a range here, which honestly is probably right inside of less as well. Key events in Nexus, we're going to have our Nexus sprint planning, short coordination meeting to talk about the big picture, talk about our overall sprint goal, any interdependencies, which items are going to go to which teams, and then the teams will go into detailed sprint planning. So this has a very similar feel to what we were looking at in less. The sprint execution, again, ends with a fully integrated product, the work of all of those teams working in the Nexus, which is then demonstrated. So we're going to hold a demonstration with maybe all of the team members, but often representatives from the team members, again, with our stakeholders, sponsors, users, interested parties, to get feedback across my whole product. The retrospective looks a little bit different. This one starts with representatives from the teams with the product owner having a conversation about how things went over this last sprint, then taking that back, having team retrospectives, and then coming back together to talk again at that whole picture level. So before it was team first, then whole last. This one is we do the Nexus discussion of the whole, go talk at the team level about the pieces and parts the teams may need to do as part of that improvement, then come back together and kind of do a capstone conversation about what is it we're going to do together in the next sprint to make our Nexus work better. And there is also refinement. So the refinement prepares backlog items for sprint planning, looks at dependencies, breaks work down, helps really, again, prepare things to make sure we're ready for sprint planning. The details of this will, again, vary a little bit depending on your situation. Might be everybody for a small part with more breakout sessions. Really, your mileage is going to vary here depending on the team composition and the work composition. A real keystone inside of Nexus is this idea of a Nexus sprint backlog. So having a backlog and then having a board, and that board's really about visualizing the dependencies across the team, understanding what teams have items that are really ready, what teams have items that are blocked, what team is working on an item that's going to then be ready for another team soon. And this would be something that the Nexus integration team would hold its daily at to look at those interdependencies across all of the teams. And if you think about what Nexus is, it's pretty similar to less in terms of why people like it. It's very simple. It's still Scrum, looks like Scrum, feels like Scrum. Also does not talk much about about portfolio management or program management or any of those aspects. And again, our product owner potentially could be spread across a number of teams. So the considerations for Nexus to me are very, very similar for the considerations of, does less feel like it's a good fit for us? Does it match kind of our culture? Does it match the way we want to work? Does it fit well within our organizational context? And last but not least of our scaling frameworks is kind of what I think of as the big kid on the block, the Scaled Agile Framework, or SAFe. SAFe is started by Dean Leffingwell. If you look at some of his books, Agile Software Requirements, if you go look in the back, you'll see a diagram that looks very similar in some ways to what the Scaled Agile Framework diagram looks like today, so you can kind of see its precursors. And it's kept alive by a group, and they're doing revisions on a regular basis. If you go look at the Scaled Agile Framework website now, you'll see the latest release has a really strong focus on business agility, and that there's been a number of things they've refactored in their website to have that focus on business agility and to ensure the parts and pieces of SAFe align with that. So very much all of these are living and evolving frameworks as we learn more. At the heart of SAFe is something called the Agile Release Train. This is typically a long-lived, cross-functional group of people who can deliver value. It's usually about 50 to 125 people working on a train together. The trains are stood up, so if you're implementing SAFe or rolling it out for the first time, you've been a very project-oriented organization, you're going to be looking across that organization and finding value streams. What are the groups of people from the different parts of the organization that need to come together to deliver something that's meaningful to our clients, our users, or our stakeholders? We'll stand up an Agile release train there, and those people will stay on that Agile release train and work on items of value flowing through that train, program increment over program increment over program increment. So they run on basically a fixed planning rhythm called a PI, or program increment, These are typically 8 to 12 weeks. A lot of people will say they're 10 weeks. They're a fixed time box. So you wouldn't do 8 and then 10 and then 12 and then 8. You'd pick one and start to run with that. You can really think of this as a planning rhythm. It's in some ways, I think of it as kind of a giant sprint. All right, for the next 10 weeks, what are the big things that we're going to work on across all of this train? And we'll talk about something called PI planning, where the teams would understand that work, break it down, do planning, get prepared. The ART incrementally delivers features or features and enablers from something called a program backlog. So again, we have a single master backlog across all of these teams that the teams are pulling from. There's a few key roles on the Agile release train. Obviously, we've got Agile teams. This could be Scrum teams, Kanban teams, a mix of Scrum and Kanban teams. A lot of the organizations that I work with will do things like all of the feature teams are Scrum, but then we have, say, some teams like the DevOps team or the automation team, the team who's building the framework for other teams on the ART. And those teams are running Kanban, so they can be a little more flexible and faster in delivery than a 2-week sprint. So the base of an ART is obviously our Agile teams delivering value under the larger umbrella. We also have an RTE. You can think about an RTE as like a chief scrum master or an Uber scrum master. This is the person who's responsible for, are we planning the program increment? Are we working together on the program increment? Who do we need to get together to sync? They might be doing things like PO syncs, making sure the POs are coordinating on a regular basis, Scrum master syncs, or core team meetings to make sure that we're dealing with the tactical day-to-day items. They're prepping for an inspect and adapt meeting where we do process improvement across the ART. There's also a systems architect or a systems engineer. This person is responsible for the architectural runway that the train's going to use. So I think of them as kind of laying tracks in front of the train from an architectural perspective, making sure that we've got enough infrastructure, guidelines, guidance, componentry, microservices, whatever in that particular product or solution is laying out for its tracking. This person is really responsible for that and responsible for ensuring that the right things are going into the program backlog via enablers so that those can be appropriately planned into the program increments. And we're laying enough track far enough ahead of the train that this is all going to run smoothly and efficiently. And product management. They're responsible for defining the features that are in our program backlog and ensuring those features are really providing business value, giving people an understanding of what the acceptance criteria are for those features, prepping them appropriately for PI planning, approving them in a system demonstration. So really making sure that the value delivery part is being done. And so there'll be a relationship between these groups with the enablers coming from the architecture group and the features coming from product management, and that really feeding into the backlog that feeds all of these teams in the ART. This program increment boundary is a really important one. You can kind of think about this as an Uber sprint boundary. We're going to do it every 10 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever we've picked. As the previous program increment winds down, we're going to have an IP sprint. And that's really going to be where we're doing prototyping, research, building some infrastructure, doing things that prepare us for the next PI. We may do any final integration testing or documentation which couldn't be completed inside the iterations. This should be as small as possible. We don't want to be deferring all the testing to this particular boundary. This is just things that weren't able to be done, and we're kind of tying a nice little bow around the work already done throughout the previous program increment. We're also going to hold our process improvement meeting. So we call that an inspect and adapt meeting. And here everybody on the art is going to get together and talk about what are the things that are going well, what are the things that are problematic, what are the causes of the things that are problematic, and what are we going to do better in the next program increment. And then we'll conduct our PI planning session. So we'll really make sure we build our plan of attack for the next program increment. And once that is all done, then we're off and running for our iterations. So if I've got 10 weeks, I've got 2-week sprints, I'm going to be looking at one of these and 4 of these for 5 iterations and 10 weeks. And the PI planning is really going to pull from my program backlog and prep it for my upcoming iterations. Once we're off and running, then the Agile teams are really going to create that integrated software. They're going to have something we'll talk about in the next slide when we talk about PI planning. They're going to have their own individual team objectives and their own individual backlog, but that's also part of building and delivering the train objectives. So their individual team objectives are really hooked into that larger set of objectives that the overall train is actually producing as well. We'll also be doing system demos. So those are a demonstration of the fully integrated work across all of the teams on the train to get feedback from our stakeholders. And then SAFE thinks about this as it's a planning rhythm. So I'm going to have my 10-week planning cadence, but I could release anytime I wanted. And so I can have the idea of maybe I'm deploying every day and I'm releasing whenever, from a product management perspective, we think it is time to release something. We turn on the feature flags, we do a phased deployment, we announce and launch it. And all of those things are really separated and decoupled from the PI boundary itself. So PI planning, one of the big events, some people will talk about this as big room planning, same basic concept underneath it. It's a multi-day event where we're going to create plans and goals for our upcoming PI. So if we're planning 10 weeks worth of work across 15 teams, that's a lot of teams to bring together and align. And that's what this is about. This is about collaboration, about alignment, about building a plan of attack that everybody on the train thinks we're going to be able to successfully deliver in the upcoming program increment. So obviously we'll want to make sure we're well prepared for this. You don't want to enter into a 2-day event flying by the seat of your pants. You'll see a lot of preparatory work being done by the product management organization, by the architects, and by the business to make sure that we are ready to share the business context. We either are re-sharing the vision just to make sure everybody understands that it stayed the same and it's up to date, or if things have changed, they know about that. We share the roadmap so that people know where we think we're going for more than just one PI at a time. People get a sense for, in the larger context, here's where we're going. And in this program increment, here are the top 10 features that we really plan to deliver in this upcoming PI. So those are all inputs. Once we have completed PI planning, what we'll have is a set of objectives. These are the PI objectives are at the art level. What are the core things we are trying to do? And you're going to see that we have a set of things that we're pretty comfortable we can do. And then you'll have maybe 1 or 2 others that are kind of in the uncommitted state. We might get to these, but we might not. They're really not part of the commitment, but it's possible that they'll actually be delivered within this PI. Then every team will have its own set of team objectives. So what are we doing that is part of these overall objectives? What is our piece of this puzzle that we're going to be building in this upcoming program increment? We'll also have a program board. The program boards are nice because they really visualize what are the dependencies across teams. And you can see these very large boards that have each of the iterations or the sprints in them. I have each of my teams. And then I have this chaining through it of what are the teams going to deliver and when do I kind of expect that delivery. I think that this team's going to deliver something fairly early in iteration 1 of this upcoming PI to be consumed by another team in iteration 2. So you start to get that feeling for here are the pieces where I need work of multiple teams coming together to deliver value across this grouping of teams. And I think that visualization and that understanding is really, really helpful going in, and then we can use things like Scrum Master Syncs and PO Syncs to make sure that we keep up to date on that as the PI progresses. We'll also look at what risks exist, and we're going to roam those risks. We're going to look at what are the risks that could impact us or hit us in this upcoming PI, and we're going to talk about whether those are resolved, accepted, owned, or mitigated. So we do a little risk management in this as well. We do a final vote. Is everybody confident? Might do a fist of 5 vote for that. Are we all confident we're going to be able to successfully land this PI? And once this is all done, then we are off and running. A lot of the organizations that I've worked with that are geographically distributed will find it's a little bit more than a 2-day event, just because you'll have, let's say we've got the group in Seattle and the group in Bangalore. There's going to be some combined time where we're all talking together. There'll also be some planning time where Bangalore plans while we're asleep, we plan while they're asleep, we get back together, we talk about that more. So often that's more like a 2.5-day session just because of the time zone overlap. We've talked a lot at the art level, or what is called the essential safe level, but there's a lot of things above essential safe. Many people will kind of start at the art level and then build on top of it and bring in the pieces that make sense for them. Some people doing fairly large solutions need a solution train, which is basically a grouping of arts. So I've got maybe 3 arts underneath a solution train because I need many, many people working together to build pieces of self-driving cars, all of the systems and all of that coming together. I need more than one art could do. So there's that piece that is kind of a you use it if you need it piece, and then there's the portfolio management piece that really lives above the solution trains and above the arts. Here's where we hook into the business. So this is where things are, there are strategic themes that really help us understand what we're doing from a business strategy perspective. We've got a portfolio backlog at this level, which is really talking about epics that feed the features that are going to go into the program backlog for the arts. And we're talking about architectural enablers at the highest level, anything that we really need to do that sort of supports enterprise architecture across all of our arts, or a mix of solution trains and arts that we're running. So if you look at all of these pieces with essential and large solution and portfolio, you start to see that there's a lot inside of SAFE. And if I think about the background of SAFE, the first time I heard people kind of talking about some of the things that Dean was doing, I was inside of Symbian, which at that time was like 1,000 people working on a phone OS. And the first time I saw a diagram outside of the book and in a PowerPoint, I was in Nokia with a group that had about 3,000 people working on a phone family. And certainly when you start thinking about things that are that scale, that complexity, yeah, a lot of the things inside of SAFE to me start to make a lot of sense. It's a lot of people to coordinate. That's a lot of, often those organizations had a lot of dependencies. There was a lot of need to integrate work, and the integration wasn't necessarily something that was all already in place with a really nice continuous deployment pipeline that was all automated and all of that. Those systems were being evolved and modernized as we went, so there was non-trivial work in doing all those integration. I start to see a lot of the reasons why a lot of what's in SAFE is in SAFE. So people will often say SAFe is a great fit for organizations that have a really large product or solution in a complicated ecosystem. I've definitely had a lot of customers who use it when they have things where there's just a lot of coupling between the teams. Maybe the infrastructure, like I was talking about, the continuous deployment pipeline is not as modern and streamlined as they want. And they need more management around the work just to make sure all the pieces are coming together in the right ways and everything is really being integrated in the right ways. I personally don't think that SAFe is really optimized for very small organizations or very small teams. When people come to me and they have, 5 teams and they say, I'm thinking about SAFe, like, there's a lot of really great patterns. And I'll talk in the recommendations about some patterns that you can use regardless of what you adopt. So I think the scaling challenge to me is just simple enough that I don't need to introduce something that has all the pieces and parts that SAFe has. So I think SAFe, well, many people criticize it as being too heavyweight, too prescriptive, not very agile. I definitely think there are places where SAFe is the right thing for that organization, given the state of the product they have, given the situation they have, given the complexity of the ecosystem they're building it in, the sizes of the teams they have. So for me, scaling frameworks aren't really about this one's good, that one's bad, or always use this one, never use that one. It's really about 2 things. One, pick the right framework for you. Or if you don't feel like you're one of those groups where any of the frameworks feel quite right, let's talk about some recommendations that are distilled from all of the scaling frameworks. So the way I think about a lot of these things are, what are the commonalities I'm seeing across all of those frameworks? So that I can distill out some tools I can put in my toolbox and we can use them with the frameworks. So making sure we're doing a good job if they're already built in, or add to the framework if they really don't exist there, or just bring into the organization to address the particular challenges that that organization is seeing right now. So in terms of scaling recommendations, my first one is, can you simplify the problem? So people will talk about recommendation for scaling, recommendation 1 for scaling. Don't. But are there ways that we can actually really simplify it and make scaling easier? So these would be choices like using feature teams. When I have feature teams instead of component teams, I'm really making sure that I'm minimizing the dependencies. I can take a piece of work and give it to a team and they can own it holistically. Versus, okay, team 1's going to do database work, and then I'm going to hand it to team 2, and they're going to do API work, and team 3 is going to build the UI on top. Now I just have a lot more dependencies. So can I make it simpler by structuring the teams? And maybe I need to do a little restructuring of the system too to support restructuring of the teams, Conway's Law at work, to make it simpler for us to feed the work into teams and for them to release it independently. Can I find ways to make teams more independent? Things like microservice architectures, having really good continuous deployment pipelines, refactoring the architecture to be able to enable people to deliver value by themselves without having to coordinate with all of the other teams. So I'm often thinking about, rather than like managing dependencies, can I dissolve dependencies? Can I find ways to descale or to make my scaling challenge easier so I have to do less with it? Recommendation number 2, build on a solid foundation. Use high fidelity Scrum, high fidelity Kanban at the team level. If the foundation is broken, it's really hard to scale that up. I need to make sure that the teams are doing a really good job of building high quality deliverables at the end of every sprint. If they're doing that, integrating that work becomes a lot easier. If there are real gaps there, we need to address those in order to really be successful. And to do that, recommendation number 3 is establish really strong technical practices. We want to look at things like continuous integration, continuous deployment pipelines, automated testing, both unit integration and functional testing. A lot of organizations I've worked with who are doing a wonderful job at good, fast value delivery also incorporate test-driven development. the idea of writing the tests before we write the code, so that we're really thinking about how do I make the code testable? How do I design for testability? Using static code analysis, so looking for coverage or looking for cyclomatic complexity in areas that we want to make sure that we make simpler so they're less error prone. Gating check-ins so that we make sure that certain things occur before the code ever gets checked in. Lots and lots of automation along the way, automated regression testing, automated deployment pipelines, coverage metrics, all of these really thinking about quality as enabler, and think about what are we doing at the team level and the infrastructure level that allows all of these teams to build working software frequently. I would like working software every minute of every day. If I can't get that, can I get it daily? If I can't get that, can I get it at least once a sprint? If I can't do that, then I'm going to be looking at something like SAFe with the system demo within sprint N+1. So in sprint 22, we're going to be integrating the work of sprint 21 and demonstrating that. So I want to make sure I'm moving towards having something that is potentially shippable as often as we possibly can, given the system that we're working on today. And that varies a lot. I've been in organizations who deploy every single hour of every day whenever they want. And I've been in organizations who are working really hard to make sure that in sprint N+1 within a PI, they're getting something that's fully integrated because it's a large legacy system with a big history of manual testing. So I always think of this as a journey. You're starting from where you are now, but you really want to make sure that you're investing in upping the game in your technical practices over time. We also want a gold standard definition of done, so I want to make sure all of my teams are all singing the same tune when it comes to a shared quality bar. We're only as strong as the weakest link of what we're building, and so making sure that everybody's building either to the exact same definition, or I build a baseline that's the minimum. Every team has to do at least this, but they could do more if they wanted to, but you have to do at least this. We need to find ways to align work across the teams. So here we're looking at things like SAFe has a seat at the table for product management, and that's really about making sure that that program backlog reflects the priorities of the business across all of those teams. Or if I don't have that, I'm often talking about something like a chief product owner, the product owner of the product owners, the ultimate decision maker across my 10 product owners or my 15 product owners working with my teams. Who's making the call about the priority across the whole backlog of work? Speaking of which, we want a whole backlog of work. I want a master backlog or a program backlog. I want one place. And that's a place where the teams, through filters and team assignments and views, can see their pieces of it. But as a chief product owner or a product manager, I can see the priority of the features, or I can even look at the priorities of my initiatives or my capabilities or whatever the top level of my portfolio is. So I have that ability to look at different levels of abstraction and look at the priorities at different levels of abstraction. PI planning is one way to also align work across teams, where we make sure that we take that prior to this backlog and then the teams say what pieces of they're doing it. In sprint planning inside of LESS and Nexus, we're also doing that. We're taking our overall backlog and deciding who's going to do what pieces. So just making sure I understand what parts of the puzzle different people are doing, and then how I'm going to bring those pieces back into a clear picture that I can see us building as we go. Shared cadence, I rarely run across anybody anymore who isn't doing a shared cadence, but this idea being that everybody is on the same iteration length or sprint length. Across all of my teams, we're all at 2 weeks, and we all end our sprint on Wednesday afternoon every other week, and we do sprint planning on Thursday morning, or whatever your cadence is. But it's an aligned cadence so that I have those moments in time where I can look at the work across all of those teams and seeing it all come together. System level events are important for us to be able to see that big picture. So here, from a tactical perspective, I'm looking at things like core team meetings, Scrum of Scrum meetings, or product owner sync meetings that are, product owner sync meeting might be 1 to 2 times a week. Scrum of Scrums might be 1 to 3 times a week. Core team meetings probably 1 to 3 times a week too, where we're really looking at what's happening inside of the sprint right now, or what's happening in the work the team is doing this week if you're more on a pure Kanban world. So these are a little bit more tactical. I also want a product level retrospective or an inspect and adapt meeting on some regular rhythm. I want to make sure that we get together above the teams and talk about what's happening from a system level that we need to address. My general recommendation to people is to do a product level retrospective either once a sprint or once a month. I think you need a regular rhythm that's fairly frequent at looking at this. And that really comes from the fact every time I've been in an organization, I work with 5, 6+ Scrum teams. I find a list about this big of what the Scrum teams need to fix, and I find a list about this big of what the organization needs to fix to enable the teams to be effective. Right? The teams probably need to do better refining, maybe need to up their game in the definition of done, maybe there's some role gaps that we need to address. But the organization perhaps needs to be investing in our build system because it takes us 3 days to move things from a developer's machine into the QA environment for the QA testing we want to do inside of a sprint. Or perhaps we've got metrics in place that de-incentivize people from working with each other. Those are issues no one team can fix, but if I fix them, I make the whole system better. So I need a forum for doing those kinds of things. Similarly, I want a way of looking at my whole product. I don't want to just look at the pieces of the product. I want to be able to look at how are all those pieces coming together into my whole solution. And so a system demo or a sprint review or a product demo, some places these replace the team level demonstrations, like in Lesson Nexus. In some places they supplement them, like in SAFe. So some way, some fashion, either instead of or in addition to, I want to be able to see the totality of what we're building really being highlighted for feedback, because that's the meeting that most often stakeholders really want to go to. They don't want to go to 10 individual team meetings. They want to see the totality of what we're building. And then things like communities of practice or guilds. How do I do knowledge sharing? How do I help us get better? There might be a community of practice for product owners, a community of practice for Scrum Masters, a community of practice around test-driven development, because that's a new practice we're bringing into our organization. And then the last recommendation is to continuously seek excellence. The organizations that I work with generally are on a journey. There are some things they want to do better and they want to work on that. And the best organizations I've worked with are a little self-critical on themselves. They're the kind of organizations who are always saying, what is the next thing that we can do that will make us a better organization? So seeking to always improve, think about quality, not as something that it costs me money, but quality is an accelerator. Having leadership really tout that. And help us infuse the changes that we need in tooling, infrastructure, training, and other things to help us build quality in as we go. Seeking about flow, looking for ways to flow value quickly across my value stream and deliver value to my customers, and making sure that what I am flowing through my systems really is customer value. So being an organization that has fast, smooth, predictable flow that delivers value that our clients and customers are excited about. So in conclusion, from a framework comparison perspective, I do think SAFe provides the best support for enterprise considerations. Lesson Nexus are really great for organizations who just want a simple way to scale Scrum up. That's going to really resonate with them. SAFe is typically more than small teams or organizations really need. Instead, we can think about distilling some of the common practices out. And really what you want to be thinking about here isn't necessarily scaling Agile, capital Agile. We really want to think about It's scaling. That's the challenge that we have. In many ways, agile teams, high fidelity agile teams, make the problem a bit easier because the components that we're building on are high quality, but do recognize that you're going to want to build on a high fidelity baseline, and you're going to want to then add the pieces that make sense. And that may be safe because safe really works for you and it's a good fit for you. It may be less or Nexus because that just feels better and safe is a bit bigger than you really need. Or it may be, hey, what I really want is some of those common practices that Jenny was talking about, where I don't need to opt into any one particular framework. I can just look at, a product level review would be helpful to us. A system retrospective would be helpful to us. More work on our continuous integration pipeline would be helpful for us. And those are the things that we're really going to put in place for now. All right. And with that, Jesse, do we have questions?
Hey, Jenny, we've gotten a few questions, so I'll go ahead and ask you the first one here. Do you have a preference for one of the scaling frameworks?
I don't. I really think of it as being situational and cultural. So if I've got kind of a young, lean, fast, we really want to be really, really agile organization, I'm probably going to look at something that's more like Nexus or less. If I've got an organization that has, pretty complicated ecosystem, it's pretty big, and there's a real need to make sure that I have something like PI planning and systems demos to make sure that work is being planned effectively across all those teams and integrated effectively, then I'm going to look at something like SAFE. More often than not, sometimes I'm going in and really helping people choose a scaling framework and implement it. Often I'm going in and just looking at the situation and saying, here are the practices I think we should adopt, and just really taking practices from my toolbox rather than choosing one specific framework.
All right, here's another question, Jenny. We are using SAFE. Are there any core practices we should consider?
Well, SAFE has a lot of the practices that we talked about built in. So we talked about a product review, SAFE has a system demo. We talked about doing regular system or product level retrospectives, SAFE has the inspect and adapt meeting. So really in that mind, I think SAFE has a lot of that inside of the framework. The real thing comes to make sure you're doing those and doing them well. So don't do things just because, don't sort of do them just to say you're doing them, do them to get the purpose and the benefit behind them. And then I think you've gotten a lot of what we've talked about, except recommendation number 1, which is find ways to simplify the problem.
Thanks, Jenny. Here's another question. How do you define high fidelity Scrum teams? Is it, for example, good adherence to Scrum practices, or is it efficiency and quality of output?
Yes. It is making sure that I not just adhere to the practices, but I adhere to the reasons behind the practices, right? If you tell me we do retrospectives, but you tell me we don't learn anything or change anything from our retrospectives, you're going through the motions of a Scrum practice. You're not getting the benefit. So yes, adhere, but adhere to the reason and the purpose behind it. And in doing that, what I want is high quality outcomes.
Thanks, Jenny. Another question, we've gotten a couple like this. Can you comment on the disciplined Agile approach to scaling?
DAD, Disciplined Agile Delivery. Yeah,
yes, I believe so.
The first time I wrote a scaling talk, and one I gave, I think 4 years ago or so, I actually had less DAD and SAFE in it, but I haven't really seen that much uptake of DAD in the industry. DAD is really interesting in that I think of DAD as more of a checklist to go use to look at how well you're scaling and answer questions. And it hasn't been particularly sticky to me in the industry. And so, yeah, I just didn't spend a lot of time on it. If people want to email, you can see my email address on the slides. If you have specific questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
All right, Jenny, here's another question. Does the Construx professional development ladder cover the roles in a scaled framework?
The publicly available ones that we've made available to people as examples do not, but yes, there is support for safe roles inside of our professional development ladder.
Thanks, Jenny. I think, we're at the top of the hour, so that's all the time that we've scheduled for today. And thank you everybody else for attending and sticking with us here till the end of the Q&A. If you do have further questions, like Jenny said, feel free to reach out to me. You can reply to any of the emails that you get reminding you about this webinar, and I can forward those on to Jenny, or her email is listed there as well. Jenny, thanks very much for the presentation today.
Thank you, Jesse. Have a good day.